Welcome back. 6 days after the midterms, there is still no closure in a number of high-stakes races. Notably, no surprise here in the state of Florida, where not one but three statewide recounts underway. Those lawsuits required by law, the recounts required by law, now lawsuits, though, piling up. Election facilities like this one in Broward County are facing a Thursday deadline to report updated totals for Senate, Governor, and Agricultural Commissioner, which so far is the closest of those three races.
In the Senate race, the outgoing Florida governor, Republican Rick Scott, has seen his lead over the incumbent Democrat Bill Nelson shrink to about 12,000 votes out of 8 million cast in the state. In the governor's race, Republican Ron DeSantis running 33,000 votes ahead of the Democrat, Andrew Gillum. But that, too, is within the half percentage point margin that in the state of Florida triggers by law an automatic recount. Let's bring in some experts. Steve Basquet is the Tallahassee bureau chief of the Tampa Bay Times. Probably not sleeping a lot these days. Errol Lewis is CNN political commentator and political anchor of Spectrum News. Thank you both for being here. So, Steve, listen, what we've heard over and over in the last 24 hours from Republican officials is this claim that a judge has ruled that there has been a violation of Florida's Constitution. Listen to what the chairman of the National Republican Senatorial Committee, Senator Cory Gardner, said to Jake Tapper just yesterday about this.
Is there any specific evidence at all of anyone committing fraud or trying to steal the election, trying to change the outcome?
Well, here's the specific evidence we have. We have a court in Florida that has said there was a violation of the Florida Constitution.
Okay, does that, Steve, in any way equal voter fraud, what he's talking about? Fact check that for everyone.
No, it doesn't. The analysis here is kind of sloppy all the way around, frankly. Everybody knows Brenda Snipes has not draped herself in glory here, and there's been allegations of incompetence and trying to count some votes after the deadline on Saturday and so forth. However, the most specific thing I keep hearing is that she failed to meet a statutory standard to report totals 30 minutes after the polls close, and the law says every 45 minutes thereafter until all the votes are counted. That was the norm in basically every other county except Broward and Palm Beach. But I don't see any penalty provision in the statute for that. None.
Right.
So,
and to be clear, this
is about.
And Steve, just for for viewers at home who have trouble following the kind of minutiae of this, so the Republican contention here, the violation of the Constitution was not meeting those 45-minute reporting requirements. Not that she or others are creating votes out of the ether, which is what the president is in effect claiming, as are other Rick Scott and other Republicans.
That's right. I'm having a deja vu feeling myself because I covered the 2000 recount here extensively. I think Brenda Snipes owes the public and owes her constituents a full accounting of why it has taken so long to count the ballots in Broward County. More people voted in Miami-Dade County than in Broward, and Miami-Dade somehow managed to complete the task. Yeah.
So, Errol, to that point, Brenda Snipes is a name that people are hearing a lot about now and will continue to. Can you just walk us through what the sticking points are with her in terms of how she has previously handled elections and to Steve's point now on why her county, why it's taking such a long time there?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is, and this is, I think people have a hard time grasping this, is that there's 67 counties in Florida. Each essentially runs its own election, right? They have a startling amount of discretion as far as how they're going to implement these laws and these requirements and these timetables. Brenda Snipes, who has been there for a long time, her name came up in the 2000 recount as well. She has a little fiefdom there. And when it comes to whether or not you've got these judgment calls, was somebody online when the polls closed? Did this batch that came in, should they really have been counted? Should these mailed-in ballots really be rechecked? Should we go back to the people who sent them and double-check their signatures? She has discretion in all of these things, and in all of these cases, it has been slow. It has not been as efficient as it should be. And because it's a heavily Democratic county, every time you sort of work through it and put more votes in, which I think broadly everybody wants to see happen, make sure every vote is counted, it starts to affect the Democratic totals. And that's where Rick Scott decided to go first.
Fair enough. But big picture, Steve, I just need you to fact check what is the essential claim here from the president and other Republicans. And that is that Democrats are trying to steal the election here in the midst of a legally mandated recount. If it is fraud, why does the Florida Secretary of State, Department of State, run by a Republican appointed by Rick Scott. Why does it say the following? Our staff has not seen any evidence of criminal activity in Broward County at this time. Our top priority is a fair and accurate election. So if they're saying that, what backs up the president and other Republicans' claim that there is evidence here of an attempt to steal this election?
Right, nothing. This gets to the heart of the matter, Jim. Here it is. Late last night, the Attorney General of this state, Pam Bondi, a Republican who is leaving office, called on the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and said it has a duty to investigate this election. The FDLE Commissioner, Rick Swearingen, decided late last week that no investigation was warranted by his agency for two reasons. Rick Scott never put a request in writing, and as you just said, the Department of State has no credible accusation of voter fraud on file. I check it periodically. Allegations of voter fraud are very common in Florida. They're by and large totally unsubstantiated. They often deal with picayune issues in small local elections around the state.
Here's one of the issues, though, Errol, that you bring up. The fact that Brenda Snipes has such discretion over how she handles the counting in her county brings up what we just saw happen in Arizona. In Arizona, there was a lawsuit filed. It was just settled that says that every county has to count their votes, look at things in the exact same way. And that seems to have pleased both the Republicans and the Democrats now in Arizona. That is not the process in Florida.
Well, that's right. In fact, there are issues with the ballot design. You know, I mean, this is the thing is, again, we have security throughout the country because there's basically 5,000 local elections. One reason you can't just steal an election when it's time for the presidential election is that you can't figure out how to do it, right? Everybody's got their own standards. There are different people who are running for different offices. The ballot design, in this case, appears to be the heart of the issue, that apparently there was a big block of instructions, and then after that, underneath that, where it was kind of harder to see, you had the candidates for Senate. And so they think that's why there was such a big gap between people who voted for governor and people who voted for Senate.
Well, listen, forgive me from positing that maybe politics have a role to play in this. The president and other Republicans were challenging the results in Arizona, accusing of fraud, contradicted by the Republican governor of Arizona, other Republican officials in that state. When that lead widened to the point where the Republican doesn't look like she has a chance of winning there, they went silent. Whereas it's closer, though still no evidence that it could actually be flipped, in a recount here, closer here. Is that perhaps evidence of politics?
Well, sure. I mean, look, there's more. Understanding what's at stake and who's going to squawk the loudest kind of gives you a clue about what might be going on. I mean, for Rick Scott to sort of, kind of go crazy and say, let's send in law enforcement, the president starts making these accusations. What we know for sure is, innocently or not, every new vote that comes out of Broward County is more likely to be Democratic. With such a thin margin, regardless of the fact that there already has to be a recount, it's going to look worse and worse for Governor Scott.
Before you guys go, Steve, to you. We're sitting up here in New York. We're not there. We're not running the bureau of a newspaper down there. So what are Floridians saying?
I think Floridians are getting increasingly impatient. They want a result. It does appear that while it's narrowing little by little, as was said, I mean, it looks like we're going to have the odds favor Rick Scott going to the U.S. Senate and Ron DeSantis being the next governor, and Nikki Fried, a Democrat, pulling off a big upset and winning the Agriculture Commissioner's seat. But people want this to end for sure. Errol Lewis's point about the local election officials having a lot of discretion is right on, and you haven't seen anything yet when they start looking at these overvotes, which are subject to individual interpretation of what the voter had in mind.
Right.
But
well,
look
listen,
how
bottom line, no evidence of fraud.
And look how differently DeSantis is handling this versus Rick Scott and just his appearance this morning on Fox News. All right, guys, thank you. Very
Errol Lewis, Steve Basquet, thanks very much. Democrats are racing to protect the special counsel Robert Mueller after a known critic of him and the investigation has been picked by the president to oversee the probe as acting attorney general. Their plan to take on Matthew Whitaker.
All right, this morning, top Democrats in Congress are warning President Trump's pick for acting attorney general, Matt Whitaker, recuse yourself from the Russia Mueller probe or expect to be investigated. Listen.
Our very first witness after January 3rd, we will subpoena or we will summon, if necessary, subpoena Mr. Whitaker.
If he doesn't recuse himself, if he has any involvement whatsoever in this Russia probe. We are going to find out whether he made commitments to the president about the probe. Mr. Whitaker needs to understand that he will be called to answer, and any role that he plays will be exposed to the public.
Whitaker has criticized the special counsel multiple times in the past in public, which has key Democrats signaling that they may tie legislation to protect Mueller to a future spending bill, a move that could potentially trigger a government shutdown. Joining us now is Shan Wu. He's a CNN legal analyst. So first, Shan, on the law, just so folks understand, myself as a layman, do public comments by an official pre-appointment like this, do they create a legal justification for recusal? I mean, he wrote on CNN, he made other public comments criticizing the Mueller investigation. Is that legally relevant?
Yeah, great question. I think that's a little bit of a gray area. This is very different than the reason that Sessions had to recuse himself. His comments here certainly make him look biased, but the particular regulation, the CFR regulation that governs the recusal that Sessions invoked, goes to whether a Justice Department employee has a personal or political relationship with an entity or person under investigation. And that's arguably implicated here, and normally he would recuse. I mean, these sorts of recusals are usually done very quietly outside of the spotlight, mostly because the department and the higher-ups want to preserve the integrity and the public appearance of the department. They don't want to have a lot of attention called to what conflict there might be, so it's usually done very quietly. People err on the side of recusal. Sessions was in a very different position. I mean, two things. One, he was a surrogate for the campaign. The campaign was being investigated. And two, really, he arguably made a false statement during his confirmation hearings. I mean, he denied having any meetings with the Russians. So that's very different, but no question that he looks very biased here, and no question that if I were advising him, if I was counsel to this AG, I would tell him it would be a good idea to recuse.
Yeah, I would not hold your breath on that one. Senator Chuck Schumer said to Jake Tapper yesterday, look, it's a constitutional crisis, his words, if Whitaker doesn't recuse himself. But if you look back a long time ago, 1989, the Supreme Court ruled in U.S. v. Eaton that indeed a temporary appointment to a primary position, a principal office like this, is constitutional if the person has served in that office for 90 days, which Whitaker has. So is it a constitutional crisis?
I don't think so. There's some very well-respected legal experts who have weighed in saying that they think this is an unconstitutional appointment. I don't agree. I mean, when I was in the department, there were numerous instances where we had temporary acting people, sometimes staff people, if the Attorney General was traveling or the deputy was unavailable. I think so long as the duration is properly limited, that should be okay. I mean, I think it raises some interesting questions, but I don't think that it's an unconstitutional appointment. But if it became an attempt to declare, let's say by presidential proclamation, that he is the AG, I think that would definitely be problematic.
Final question before I let you go. How long can he serve, Whitaker, before he would require Senate approval?
I believe that the time is around 200 days. I'm not 100% clear on the exact amount of time, but the duration needs to be limited. And I think one problem is that they have not been talking about it being a limited duration, and they need to quickly say this is an acting situation and we're going to get a nominee in place.
Because I should know that a lot's could happen in the Mueller investigation during those days.
200,
a period of time in which Whitaker is overseeing it, has a lot of power to limit what Mueller could do.
Absolutely.
Shan Wu, thanks very much as always.
Good to see you.
All right, so ahead for us, a clash over nationalism, a key ally, President of France, rebuking President Trump on the world stage.
Home this morning and facing criticism over his trip to France to commemorate 100 years since the end of World War I.
Also, French President Emmanuel Macron really appearing to rebuke President Trump in person on the national stage this weekend because of the president's embrace of nationalism. As President Trump looked on, listen to what Macron said.
Patriotism is the exact opposite of nationalism. Nationalism is a betrayal of patriotism by saying, our interests first, who cares about the others? We erase what a nation holds dearest, what gives it life, what makes it great, and what is essential, its moral values.
David Sanger now, CNN political and national security analyst, also happens to be the national security correspondent for the New York Times. So, David, for the French president to use those words, yards from the U.S. president, to criticize nationalism in no uncertain terms, days after the president called himself a nationalist, is there any way that the president could not take those words as directed at him?
No, they were directed at him. If the president took it that way, he took it accurately, and it's why that he always shows up at summits like this as if looking as if he's going to a high school reunion with classmates he didn't really like, right? So you saw this throughout the weekend. So the Macron critique was twofold. One, it was the use of the word nationalism, and basically he made the argument that the bigger form of patriotism was to understand your nation's interests as interlinked with the interests of other nations as well. And in many ways, that's what the entire weekend was about, right? I mean, if you're going to do a 100th anniversary of the end of the Great War, as it was called, you want to spend your time thinking about the mistakes made that led the world to that tragedy. Yeah. And the mistakes made all had to do with just an overzealousness of nationalism, followed after World War I by overzealous isolationism by the United States. And I think that was part of the message, too.
Do you think, David, that the 44 hours that President Trump spent there in Paris with world leaders did more to bolster the transatlantic partnership or more to just further expose its cracks? I mean, regardless of talking points from either side, when you really look at it, what did we get?
Poppy, you got a graphic on television illustration of what we've all heard from talking to European leaders and even Americans who deal with Europeans. You had a president who, perhaps for perfectly legitimate reasons of weather, didn't show up at the first cemetery commemoration. His staff managed to find a way to do that, and even if they had to drive. You've had a moment where all of the leaders were supposed to be coming down to the Arc de Triomphe together. Only two showed up late, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. So that sort of sent a message. Yeah. And these are highly coordinated events, and all it just seemed to do was illustrate the splits.
Let me ask you this. I'm sure you speak to European diplomats, national security officials. I will ask them, I'll say, how does that public tension affect the private relationship, intelligence sharing behind the scenes, defense cooperation, etc.? And they will tend to say, listen, relationship is strong as ever at this level. Is that true from what you hear? And is it possible for that to last when the commander-in-chief and the president of France are clearly on such different pages? How do those relationships stay so strong?
It's a difficult thing to nurture, and Jim, from your time here in Washington covering this same area, that the professionals say that they've built up their own relationships and they're there to work with each other no matter who the president is. And much of the intelligence community and much of the diplomatic community, they're made of career people who know that they will be here after Donald Trump is no longer president and after Macron is no longer president, and they sort of build up their business. On the other hand, what's happening at the top has got a corrosive effect. I'll give you one clear example. The president's announcement with no notification to the Europeans, or no consultation, I should say, that he was going to withdraw from the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, they felt put the Europeans in the Russian target set here without having consulted with them. And that is deeply corrosive now. That we now know the president's likely to take that up with Putin when they meet in Argentina.
They're the target of those medium and short-range missiles. It's natural for
That's
them
right.
to be afraid of them. David Sanger, thanks very much.
And David, great piece this morning in the Times. We didn't have time to get to it, but everyone should read your most recent reporting on North Korea and their ramping up on the ballistic missiles program. Thanks for being with us. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo warning Saudi Arabia's crown prince the U.S. will make sure that journalist Jamal Khashoggi's killers are held accountable. How will they do that? It's more than a month ahead.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is warning Saudi Arabia that the U.S. will hold everyone involved in the brutal killing of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi accountable. Riyadh insists that the Crown Prince knew nothing about the operation to target and kill the journalist. U.S. officials have said such a mission could not have occurred without the prince's knowledge and authorization. CNN's Jumana Karacha joins us now live from Istanbul. Jumana, this is a remarkable development that friends of Khashoggi, along with the Arab Turkish Media Association, they want to buy the Saudi Consul General's residence where this murder is believed to have happened. Tell us how this is happening.
Well, Jim, we attended a memorial yesterday marking 40 days since the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, and we heard from his friends there. And there is this sense they're really starting to lose hope that his body is ever going to be found, especially with that theory that Turkish authorities are looking into, that acid was used to dissolve his body. So one friend was saying that they have started this this initiative where they're collecting money to buy the residence of the Consul General. They say that they've been deprived of the ability to stand at Khashoggi's grave, so instead they want to turn that building into a memorial of sorts, and so they say that they have begun doing so, that they are collecting money, donations to try and do that. Now, of course, Jim, we still don't know. We've heard from Turkish authorities here saying they are continuing their search for the body, for the remains of Jamal Khashoggi, a determination, at least publicly, from Turkey to continue on this path. And we've heard the statements from President Erdogan this weekend saying that they have shared the evidence, recordings of the killing of Khashoggi, with the United States, with several European countries, pretty much putting the ball in the court of those countries right now to really now put the pressure on Saudi Arabia to try and get answers and to try and really, get to the bottom of this and to hold those responsible for the killing accountable. Something Turkey has been really pushing for, and so far they say they're extremely frustrated with the lack of cooperation from the Saudis.
Jumana Karacha, thank you. And we're also learning that the family is going to attempt to hold a funeral this week, even though they have not been able to find the body.
All right, so this morning, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he has not, but Canadian agents have indeed heard the recordings that are related to Khashoggi's murder. When I sat down with him for a wide-ranging interview, I asked him, so then what will Canada do to hold Saudi Arabia accountable? Listen. Canada has a $15 billion deal to sell light armored vehicles to Saudi Arabia. You said last month Canadians expect there to be consequences for Jamal Khashoggi's premeditated murder. Will Canada cancel its arms sales?
We've been working with the international community to try and get answers on the terrible murder of Khashoggi. This is something that the entire world is outraged about, and we are demanding answers on it. But I will point out that Canada has been in conflict with Saudi Arabia at a diplomatic level for a few months now, because we put out a statement condemning the arrest of a number of pro-democracy, pro-women activists in Saudi Arabia. We will continue to stand up firmly for human rights, while at the same time looking for ways to be more transparent and more accountable in the economic choices.
Yeah. Well, he wouldn't answer the question, right?
I asked
about
him
arms sales, yeah.
More. You can see that online on that issue. But just like the United States, I mean, where is the line, and what action will be taken?
And you've frankly had silence from the U.S. largely, at least on the issue of the larger relationship in arms sales. More to come on that, certainly. Meanwhile, here at home, former First Lady Michelle Obama, on the day that President Trump was sworn into office, she says what she was really thinking.
Eastern on CNN.
Do you wonder what Michelle Obama was thinking on President Trump's inauguration day? She tells all in her new book, Becoming. She says, this might not surprise you, she couldn't even try to be happy that day.
On January 20th, 2017, the nation watched the peaceful transition of power from President Obama to President Trump. Mrs. Obama, in her own words, describes coming to terms with the new reality before her.
The vibrant diversity of the two previous inaugurations was gone. Someone from Barack's administration might have said that the optics there were bad. that what the public saw didn't reflect the president's reality or ideals. But in this case, maybe it did. Realizing it, I made my own optic adjustment. I stopped even trying to smile.
The former First Lady not holding back at all in this memoir, Becoming. You just saw, the clip you just saw is from the ABC special on her memoir.
A very good Monday morning to you. I'm Jim Shue. Rather, elections that were too close to call Tuesday are the subjects of painstaking recounts required by law. Where else could that be but the state of Florida?
Right.
Election workers in every Florida county are now recounting ballots for governor, U.S. Senator, and agriculture commissioner because the law requires it when the gap between the candidates is 1.5 percentage points or less. In the Senate race, outgoing Governor Rick Scott, the Republican, holds a lead of roughly 12,000 votes over the incumbent Democrat Bill Nelson. This out of a total of 8 million votes cast. In the governor's race, Republican Ron DeSantis is running a larger margin there, 33,000 votes ahead of the Democrat Andrew Gillum. Drama all around, but nowhere more than in Broward County. CNN's Rosa Flores is there. So why the particular controversy there? There are a lot of charges of outright vote fraud, stealing an election. Is that what you're seeing there, or is it other questions?
Well, the question about fraud is an important one to talk about, Jim, because there is no evidence of fraud. Now, that is according to the Secretary of State and FDLE, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. But there is this cloud of controversy over the Sunshine State because of these three different races that are in a recount. We have seen lawsuits, protests, barbs, jabs, all directed into a geographic area of Broward County and Palm Beach County. And of course, the big question is why it has taken a little longer to count votes here in Broward County and in Palm Beach County. That is one of the things that has been mentioned here. But the governor of this state alleging right-out fraud, saying that the Democrats are trying to steal this election, but not providing any proof. Now, moments ago, Congressman Ted Deutsch was here, and he spoke to reporters and called out the Republicans for their heated rhetoric. Take a listen.
The supervisors' offices are all working hard and around the clock. We just need to ease off of the rhetoric. We need the governor and Senator Rubio and President Trump to stop spinning conspiracy theories about what's happening in our election.
Now, just yesterday, the governor filing 3 more lawsuits, one here for Broward County, alleging that the supervisor of elections counted votes after the noon deadline on Saturday, and then 2 other lawsuits, one in Broward and one in Palm Beach County, asking that the voting machines be impounded by law enforcement after the recount is done. Jim and Poppy.
Remarkable.
Just an update as we're talking there, because as Rosa noted, the Florida Department of State issued a statement this weekend. We're going to quote from it. Our staff has not seen any evidence of criminal activity in Broward County at this time. Keep in mind, Secretary of State of Florida, appointed by a Republican. I reached out to ask if they have any updates to that statement. In effect, have you seen any evidence of fraud in the last 24 hours? I just got an answer. No updates to the statement. Thank you. So the Secretary of State's office that oversees the election in Florida is saying they have seen no evidence of fraud. That has not stopped the Republican Senate candidate or the president from saying the contrary.
I'm so glad you did that. You've been calling him all morning trying to get a response.
You finally got back.
Good. I'm glad. And the Secretary of State, as you said, not only a Republican appointed by the governor, Rick Scott, in 2012.
Who's got skin in the game.
There you go. All right. So let's talk a lot more about all of this. Florida, also Georgia, Arizona. It's getting ugly out there. CNN political writer Harry Enton is with us, and Politico's Florida Bureau Chief Matt Dixon. So Matt Dixon, to you. I really just want to clearly fact-check this claim that some Republicans are making, including Cory Gardner, who chairs the National Republican Senatorial Committee, who just yesterday on CNN to Jake Tapper, when asked, is there any evidence of voter fraud, he said, well, quote, there is specific evidence. We have a court in Florida that has said there was a violation of the Florida Constitution. They are two different things here, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. What Senator Gardner had referenced there is true. There was lawsuits in Palm Beach and Broward County Court that went for Governor Scott and against the local supervisors. That was related to a public records dispute, the turning over of documents that were deemed public. It had nothing to do with outright fraud or the idea of stuffing ballots or doing anything fraud related. There's no evidence to that at this point. There was court rulings. The senator is right, but it had to do with public records, not voter fraud.
Yeah, so you have them in effect, Harry Enting, including the President of the United States from his Twitter account, followed by more than 50 million people, claiming voter fraud where there is no evidence of voter fraud here. And you have Republicans basically repeating this talking point based on something unrelated, so sort of hitting reporting requirements, but nothing related to actually changing the vote counts.
Exactly. And the thing that's so bizarre here is, yes, these races are close, but they're not so close that they're likely to be overturned in a recount, right? Remember 2000, that race was considerably closer. It was 0.03 percentage points.
518.
Right, and it went down all the way to 538 or 537, whatever it was. And it was 0.03 percentage points. Even here, the Senate race is 0.15 percentage points. It's 5 times as large of a lead. It's just very unlikely to be overturned. So why is the president coming in here saying voter fraud when they're going to win anyway, most likely?
Yeah. And Matt, to you, I mean, let's just be really clear because, the president has said a lot about this and claimed fraud multiple times. But, he said many ballots are missing or forged. Those are the words of the president. And then he says an honest vote count is no longer possible. Ballots massively infected must go with the election night. Well, let's just be clear. Florida law mandates, right, Matt? Mandates that you have recounts when the margin is this slim. And by the way, the president is not insisting on a recount when it's the ag commissioner race where the Democrat is leading.
If the president has proof or evidence of some of those things happening, he should turn them over to law enforcement. We've spoken to law enforcement many times, as it sounds like you guys have, and the Scott administration itself. Neither of them have pointed to any indications or allegations of voter fraud. So there's obviously a lot of political rhetoric out there, but thus far, sort of where the rubber meets the road, it really isn't matching some of that rhetoric.
There's also something, Matt, I just want to specify here. If Florida were to listen to the president on this and stop voting now, would that not exclude military ballots sent from overseas, which still, I believe, have until 10 days after the election? They could be received up to 10 days after the election, as long as postmarked on Election Day?
Yep, that's accurate. Overseas ballots aren't counted or aren't part of the numbers yet. And there's a 12-day span after Election Day for official results to actually be certified and actually kind of put a lid on it. So there is time yet, and there are votes yet to be counted, and that's a very normal part of Florida's process.
It can't be understated. So the president, if he were listened to, would be disenfranchising U.S. soldiers deployed overseas.
Important note. Arizona, Harry. Okay, you have a growing divide in favor of the Democrat in Arizona right now in the Senate race. But the way it's being handled is fascinating to me. That the Republicans, the Democrats, they had a settlement on Friday over sort of how the county should handle counting the rest of these. But the rhetoric just isn't the same from Republican officials in Arizona as it is from Florida.
Right. They've been through this before, right? There's a lot of mail-in ballots that get counted at different points. And remember, you have the Secretary of State there who's a Republican. They know what's going on. And she, in fact, issued a statement saying this is just part of the normal process.
Right.
This is the way elections should be handled. I should also point out that Martha McSally might get a seat in the United States Senate anyway because she might get she might get the appointment that John Kyle to fill John McCain's term. So she doesn't have as much on the line. But that's the way that we really should be handling this, because at the end of the day, not all those ballots have been counted. And the most important thing I think we can all agree is that all the votes should be counted. In Florida, that would probably lead to a Republican senator, and in Arizona, that most likely lead to a Democratic senator.
And Arizona has a lot of mail-in ballots, right? So that helps explain why it's taken so long to get to 100% precincts reported.
Correct. And they are counted over a long period of time, and they do that in order to ensure that we have the most accurate count. And I just keep saying that. That's what's important. Make sure everybody's vote is counted.
Seems a simple statement. Harry Hinton, Matt Dixon, thanks very much as always. Still to come, top Democrats have penned a letter to the Justice Department demanding that the acting Attorney General Matthew Whitaker recuse himself. What do they plan to do to protect the Russia investigation, if anything? Plus, a new report says that North Korea is moving ahead, even expanding its ballistic missile program. New satellite images show that North Korea is making improvements to some 16 hidden missile bases. We're on top of that story.
Also, we sit down exclusively with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Why did he mandate that half of the people that serve in his cabinet are women? We'll talk to him about that. And who made him a feminist? Ahead.
Are you a feminist?
Yes, absolutely. I'm a feminist because a feminist is someone who believes men and women should be equal and who believes that there's a lot more work to do to get there.
Your door. It's your medication made easy.
Tomorrow night, the race is not over yet. Votes are still being counted in critical races across America. CNN brings you all the dramatic developments. Election Night in America continued. Tomorrow night, 8 Eastern, only on CNN.
New this morning, top Democrats in Congress are asking the Department of Justice's chief ethics official if he advised the new acting attorney general to recuse himself from Mueller's Russia probe.
In a letter to the Department of Justice, Democrats highlight Matt Whitaker's past critical comments of the probe and want to know if he has been advised by ethics lawyers inside the DOJ against overseeing the probe. Let's discuss now with Sabrina Siddiqui. She is politics reporter for The Guardian newspaper, and Margaret Talev, CNN political analyst. Margaret, as you look at this, we had a lawyer on the air a short time ago, Shan Wu, and asked him, are public comments of criticism in the past, are they by law evidence of bias that would require someone to recuse? And he made the point, no, not necessarily. And I just wonder, are Democrats pointing to anything more than the public comments by him in things such as an opinion piece he wrote on CNN last year?
Yeah.
Are they pointing to anything else to back up this demand?
I think Democrats are just looking at using whatever tools they have, and the biggest tool they have right now, at least at the start of the new year, is going to be their ability to subpoena people and their ability to put political pressure and public pressure on people, and that's really the arm they're looking at right now. And I suppose potentially the threat of tying this to keeping the government open, although it sounds again that is a more rhetorical threat than anything else.
But wait, the government tying it to funding, that was about protecting Robert Mueller, right? Not just the Whitaker thing, legislation to protect the special